You've heard Billie Eilish's song about it and learned of its devastating impact on history. But what actually was the Black Death? What were its symptoms? How did people try to treat it? And how is it that we don't have something like it today? You might think that you know all there is to know about the plague, but the reality was much more complicated than you think. In fact, it was worse than you think. The Black Death, also known as the Bubonic Plague, was a horrible disease that killed millions in the Middle Ages. But while we may think of it as one of the worst diseases ever, there are things that make it even worse than you may have imagined. It took over Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Black Death didn't just strike one area or kingdom. It affected all of humanity for decades. It started in 1346, when rats carrying fleas infected with the bacteria Yersinia pestis arrived in Europe on trade ships from Asia. From here, it spread across the continent and eventually reached North Africa and the Middle East. The Black Death continued to ebb and flow for the next 200 years, killing millions each time around. There were multiple waves of the disease, which is why it lasted so long. Although it's sometimes called the Black Plague, this name only really applies to the bubonic variety. However, the disease could also affect the lungs. This pneumonic plague was just as deadly and is thought to be the cause of death of another famous historical figure, the great scientist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci. In the end, though, the plague would finally come to an end when a series of small acts by ordinary people brought it to a halt. So what exactly made the Black Death so bad? For starters, it was incredibly painful and unpleasant. Those who survived the initial infection often suffered from arthritis, and the plague left many others blind. Gangrene was also common, and people who had it said that their flesh looked like burnt toast. Not only did the disease cause intense pain and suffering, but it also led to death on an industrial scale. In Europe alone, the Black Death is thought to have killed between 75 and 200 million people. Some estimates suggest that half of all Europeans died of the disease. Of course, this is just an estimate, and historians will never truly know how many people died during the plague years. The Black Death has gone down in history as one of the most deadly diseases ever to afflict humankind. But it wasn't always fatal. Around 1/3 of those who contracted the disease survived. Still, given the effects of the illness, it must have been a relief to live through it. Even so, these survivors suffered after the plague as they lived with the physical and psychological scars of their experience. It affected every social class. When you hear about the Black Death, you probably imagine miserable peasants dying in droves. While the plague certainly devastated the poor, it didn't spare the rich. Kings, queens, popes, and peasants alike were all susceptible to the disease, and many died from it. In England, the Black Death claimed the lives of King Edward III, Queen Isabella of France, and 4 of Edward's children. 1/5 of the nobility of France is thought to have died, while 30% of the German nobility perished in the plague. The rich could perhaps buy better food and maybe more medicine, but they couldn't escape the disease any more than anyone else. It changed history forever. The massive loss of life caused by the plague had a major impact on the course of history. The population of Europe was dramatically reduced, and society was forever changed by the devastation of the Black Death. In fact, the plague had consequences that extended far beyond the years when it raged. Some historians argue that the plague contributed to the decline of feudalism, as the widespread death of peasants led to labor shortages and higher wages. The Black Death also helped bring about the Renaissance, as the focus on death and religion in the Middle Ages gave way to new ideas about the world. But if it had such a profound effect on our past, why do we not suffer from something similar today? The answer lies in our actions. People used some pretty brutal methods when treating the plague. Bloodletting was popular, as people believed that balancing the humors of the body would prevent the disease. They also used leeching, a treatment where leeches are applied to the skin to suck out bad blood. They didn't just treat the living, but the dead too. One gruesome treatment involved opening up the corpses of plague victims to see if they could find the source of the disease. These efforts often proved fruitless, and instead just made the people doing the post-mortem even sicker. Of course, people had no idea that the disease was being spread by rats and fleas. If they'd known, they may have taken more effective measures to stop it. As it was, the bubonic plague persisted for centuries, causing untold misery and death. To learn more about how we got rid of the disease for good, let's take a look at some of the craziest facts about the plague. It started in Asia. As we've already mentioned, the Black Death arrived in Europe via trade ships coming from Asia. But this isn't to say that Asians suffered any less from the disease. In fact, the plague first struck hardest in China. In 1331, Itzi thought that over 10 million people were wiped out in the first 6 months of the outbreak in Asia. The disease then spread along trade routes, reaching India, Persia, and Turkey before arriving in Europe. It likely would have hit the rest of the world, too, but it simply dissipated. When this happened, no one knew why the plague was suddenly going away. But in hindsight, it was likely due to a combination of factors. The warmer climate in Asia and Africa meant that rats and fleas didn't survive as easily there as they did in Europe. Also, humans in warmer climates tended to live in different ways. They built different homes that were less hospitable to rodents and didn't keep as many cats around to kill the rats. Although the Black Death is now thankfully gone, there is still a country where the disease can be found. Plague is still present in parts of the world today. But rather than being a serious threat, it's more of an annoyance. In Madagascar, plague is endemic. This means that the disease is constantly present in the country. However, the Madagascan plague is mainly a problem for prairie dogs. Only around 100 cases of plague are recorded in humans each year, which makes it more of a minor concern. A lot of people died very quickly. Many people who died from the plague succumbed to the disease within a week. Once symptoms began to appear, the end was often near. Most people felt the first signs of the disease in their groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes grew rapidly, becoming filled with pus and blood. At this point, it was clear that the person had the plague, and death was usually imminent. As the buboes burst, the pain lessened, and the person entered the second stage of the disease. Their entire body became infected and organs started to fail. The final stage was when the blood poisoning began. The person's blood turned to a horrible black color, hence the name Black Death. At this point, death was almost certain, and it usually occurred within a few days. Some people survived by accident. We now know that the best treatment for the plague is antibiotics. However, the people who survived the plague didn't use modern medicine. Instead, they either got lucky or were treated with a mixture of herbs, animal fat, and bread. Many also tried religious cures, including confessing their sins and getting absolution from a priest. Others went to extreme lengths to cure themselves, including bathing in cold water, drinking vinegar, and putting on creams made from poisonous substances. None of these cures worked, but some of them may have helped ease the symptoms of the disease. Now you need to watch. What happens to your body after you die? Or check out weirdest diseases you didn't know you could catch.